To the south of the Old World, beyond the fiefdoms of the Border Princes and the arid Badlands, lies an immense desert. This land, known for the scorching sun and sandstorms capable of stripping flesh from bone, is often believed to be purely the domain of the dead. An empty wasteland where the only things of value are buried deep beneath the sands, waiting for foolish adventurers. Yet, there is life to be found in these lands, by the coasts and beneath the mountains, even dwelling among the shadows of the dunes. For here lies one of the nations of men, a people made hardy and resourceful by their harsh environment. Humans who have learned to survive against the undead legions of Nehekara and to master the elements and winds of magic alike. This is the nation of Araby. Hello everyone, Lore Master of Sotek here, and this is gonna be a big one, so please grab yourself something to drink, put on some tea, maybe grab a snack. I'm gonna be talking for a hot minute. So a while back, a good little while back now, I made a video that I'll link down below talking about how minor race packs would be a great way to bring additional races into the game that might have various conflicts preventing them from being implemented as a larger roster. Minor race packs meaning a new race, like the Chaos Dwarfs, for instance, but a smaller, more focused roster and experience. In that video, I promised to put out videos focusing on the various factions that I think would function best within this system. So this is the first, and in my honest opinion, the most important, in which I will be talking about Araby, the mysterious desert nation that hugs the northwestern shore of the Southlands. By far the most critical of the minor races, in my personal opinion, due to the incredibly unique dynamic that they bring to the nations of men when compared against the likes of Bretonnia, the Empire, and Grand Cathay. For the structure of these videos, I'll be giving a brief, though of course my version of brief, so overview on the race for those unfamiliar with them, followed by the overall proposal for the race. So we're going to be talking about mechanics, legendary characters, and rosters. This is just to plant the idea of how they would function in the game, in my humble opinion. Just remember that frankly my view holds no more weight than anyone else's, so please make your own version of how you'd like Araby to work, and put that stuff on Twitter, the Total War subreddit, or my Discord, whatever floats your boat. I'd love to see it. I really like seeing this kind of stuff. And I do want to say, before I really get into it, that I understand that Araby, when a lot of people see it, they go, oh, they couldn't possibly do Araby. Like, Games Workshop would never do Araby. They can't. Like, Araby is such a taboo. It's really not. Araby is not really what a lot of people think it is. I think when a lot of people look at Araby, they immediately kind of start rustling their jimmies because they think, oh, it's like the Muslim group. But you have to remember that none of the Abrahamic religions exist in Warhammer Fantasy. Nothing even like them exists. They're completely non-existent. They're not there. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they're just not there. They don't have any reflections within the Warhammer world, or anything that might kind of reflect on them is so far distant that the threads are just not really there. The vast majority of the Warhammer world, if they have religions, they're all extremely polytheistic, and there's like lots and lots and lots of different gods. A lot of people tend to kind of look at a very surface level understanding of the lore and get into their head that like, oh, this is so and so and this is so and so. It's just not that. There's really not as much. The Warhammer world doesn't have as much of like, oh, this race is this group from our world. That's actually pretty rare most of the time. Often it is a mythology or a particular story or narrative that is reflected as opposed to an actual cultural group, which is good because if everything's a reflection of a cultural group, you can run into problems really, really quickly. But that's not what they are. Where Araby is far more drawn from the stories of like the tales of Arabian Nights. And it's far more about specific stories and smaller myths that are far more widespread in the cultural zeitgeist, if I use that word correctly, which I probably didn't. But anyway, you know what I mean. I will note that if you go far enough back into Araby's lore, there was a time where it did have Islamic reflections, where like if you go far enough back, you could find notes about like there being like an Allah type figure, but that's all completely been scrubbed out of the lore, and that's no longer remotely canon and does not have anything to do with modern Araby, which is good, because if it did have that, then I do agree that it could be a sticky subject, but it doesn't. So I don't think there's any need to look at Araby and say that, oh, it's it's like it's too scary. Like, no, it's really fine. It really truly is fine. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through what is Araby. And, you know, I'm sure this is a discussion that we'll have down in the comments. I have met people, it's not unusual for Araby to get brought up, and I'll have someone in a comment section or the chat in a live stream be like, oh, they can't do Araby. It's like, shut up. No, it's fine. And I will happily debate you on it down below. Friendly, of course. Let's everyone be nice to each other. So in any event, when looking into the history and design of Araby, they're a fairly complicated subject. The Arabians are not part of a traditional nation. Instead, it is a collection of nomadic desert tribes, corsair fleets, and wealthy cities who share a common culture and ancestry. They are bound together by ancient pacts, but resist a singular leader after suffering under the tyranny of the infamous Sultan Jafar, who we'll circle back around to. The people of Araby were forged through hardship and suffering, as in the past millennia, they were simply nomadic desert tribes that lived on the outskirts of the Nehekaran Empire. After the death of Setra the Imperishable, his titanic nation began to shrink considerably, and the Arabians were one of many cultures that were able to slip free of control. Many of the port cities we know today were established during this time and began to thrive by focusing on the development of mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and sorcery. However, not all would end well, as the looming specter of the great necromancer Nagash began to form in the east. Nagash desired absolute domination of the world and required countless men upon whose suffering he would build his empire. The Arabians did what they could to survive this period, but were woefully outnumbered and outgunned by the power of Khemri's legions. Their knowledge of how to live in the desert, traveling between hidden oases, and launching devastating raids on those who would intrude upon their lands. Eventually, Nagash would fall, and Nehekara would flourish for a short time until the great necromancer unleashed his vengeance upon the cradle of human civilization. Nehekara would become the land of the dead, as all within the once fertile riverlands were poisoned by horrific artifacts and rituals of dark magic. By this point, the inner turmoil of Nehekara had allowed Araby to burgeon once more into a glorious era, but already they were haunted by portents of doom. Few sheiks and emirs had noticed the vampire refugees that had fled from Nagash's legions to settle among them, most notably the blood dragon Abarash and the first vampire, Neferata. Here the two would remain until the failed great ritual of Nagash caused the dead of Nehekara to rise. The Tomb Kings had emerged, fighting a civil war for control until Setra the Imperishable himself awoke to dominate all who would not bow before him. Due to Setra's victory, the notorious servant of Nagash known as Archon the Black was forced to flee Khemri. The Lich turned his attention to the west and summoned forth vast legions of undead marching against the people of Araby. This era, known as the Wars of Death by Arabian scholars, sees the nightmarish hordes of Archon bring absolute devastation to their lands. The once great city of Bel Aliad feels the cold wrath of the Lich King as the population is cruelly massacred. The obliterated ruin is known forever afterwards as the City of Dust. Never again would the Arabians have the comfort of being able to roam the inner deserts in safety, for the dead do not rest easy in these lands, and none can know for certain what may lurk beneath the dunes. With the Wars of Death fully underway, the lands of Araby were thrown into turmoil. A fair amount of their knowledge was lost during this time, but more importantly, their progress in the various fields of magic and science ground to a halt without safe bastions of civilization from which to serve as places of learning. For nearly 1,000 years, the Arabians were forced to change their very way of life, focusing heavily on nomadic living and stealth when not in the most heavily fortified cities, which were all sizable ports. At long last, the undead assaults on the realms of the living dwindled, and Archon the Black faded into the pages of history for a time. A tentative peace returned to the deserts, the Arabians able to venture forth from their hidden villages in the Vulture Mountains and coastal cities. Trade from the newly established empire of Sigmar and the lands of Telea began to trickle in, a new age on the horizon. As contact flourished with the wider world, Araby quickly established itself as a hub where all sorts of exotic goods could be found, even allowing the trade of slaves, which was a practice outlawed in some nations. This trade allowed the nation to flourish with major figures in the cities growing in power as they accumulated vast wealth, causing the rise of sultans, who ruled over impressive armies armed with only the best soldiers and weaponry. They also began seeking control of Araby itself, binding the various desert tribes to them through oaths that none would dare break lest they be dishonored if not outright executed. For the Arabians deeply, deeply value the oath of one's word, and to break your word is to communicate that you are unworthy of trust, let alone brotherhood. Araby continued to recover despite the return of Archon the Black in 111 of the Imperial calendar, as the Lich King focused far more on the lands immediately surrounding his Black Tower and dealing with those Tomb Kings that ill tolerated his presence. The various arts and sciences would bloom once more in the desert lands, and Arabian sorcerers learned much by binding the elemental creatures they encountered in the desert, known as jinns or ifrits. These magical entities taught them much about the secrets of magic, as the Lich Priests of Nehekhara had done in ages past. And in fact, there was far more magic for this era of the Arabian sorcerers than those we knew in the past, as the Black Pyramid of Nagash drew significantly more magic to this part of the world, which before that time had been known for being an area where magic was far more rare, or at the very least weaker. Meanwhile, in the arts of science, it was the genius inventors of Araby who first crafted the long-range gun known as the Jezzail, and their innovation on powerful guns would only continue to develop. That is, until the seed of a terrible calamity snuck into the burgeoning civilization. In circa 1230 of the Imperial calendar, the mad Arabian sorcerer Mahik al-Rak created the Portal of Twilight from a series of enchanted mirrors. In his arrogance and insanity, the fool's creation opened enough of a connection to the realm of chaos that Al-Rak was possessed by a lord of change that had manipulated him to this very moment. The demon would go on to heavily influence the future magical practices in Araby, corrupting it for the greater glory of Tzeentch. the land would forever bear the taint of corruption until the end of days. The antics of the Dark God wouldn't be limited only to the domains of magic, as the more warlike cultures within Araby would become more aggressive, and those seeking power turned to crueler methods to grab and maintain their thrones. Only a few years later, in 1240 of the imperial calendar, the infamous Corsairs of Araby would invade the island of Sartosa, where they would remain the dominant force for the next 250 years. This proved only to be the beginning, however, as the Corsairs would terrorize the seas, while back in Araby itself, a new power was building. In the decades following the start of the 15th century, the terrifying sultan known as Jafar rose to prominence in the city of El Haik. While known as a black-hearted and cruel man who desired the world as his no matter the cost, few knew the true depths to which he would sink in pursuit of victory. The great Sultan Jafar struck bargains with the insidious Skaven and the maddening demons of Zinch, so that he could have his rivals assassinated and legions of nightmarish creatures to obliterate those that stood against him. Soon enough, the Corsairs of Sartosa and the Arabian coast fell under his sway, as did all of the other cities. And even the seemingly endless desert tribes were bound by oaths offered out of awe or terror. With the entire nation of Araby enslaved beneath his will, the Sultan turned his attention to the old world, and with a suddenness that beggared belief, launched an invasion of Telea and Estalia. Thus began the Crusades in 1448 of the imperial calendar. This terrible war would rage on for 3 years, until the Crusaders from Bretonnia and the knightly orders of the Empire managed to slay Jafar at the climactic Battle of Al Haik in 1451 of the imperial calendar. Those 3 years crippled much of the nation, but Arabians were no strangers to hardship and began the long process of rebuilding once more. Many folk had made honest allies with the various crusaders who had freed them from the Sultan's oppression and left to explore the old world with their newfound friends. Sartosa would be recaptured by Telea in 1501 of the imperial calendar, though with Jafar dead, a good number of the Arabian Corsairs simply sold their services as mercenaries. After this point, Araby mostly faded into relative obscurity, as the nations of the old world exploded in strength and population. That's not to say the folk of the desert weren't important, as their ports would continue to be some of the grandest in the world, full of traders from across the globe. The people of Araby had proved more than capable of defending their homeland in the 1,000 years that followed, cautious against the likes of Jafar ever rising to power again. Few can rival their skill at warfare in the desert, especially cavalry, as Arabian stallions are considered the pinnacle of horse breeds outside of fair Ulthuan. With the overall gist of who Araby is out of the way, let's talk about how I'd actually envision the faction. So, starting with mechanics. I think the main focus for Araby is a mixture of dealing with the Arabian Corsairs, forging magical artifacts, and capturing the elemental spirits of the desert to learn their secrets. For the Arabian Corsairs, they're a sect of slaver pirates, essentially who capture people from other ships and force them into slavery to be sold to the more sinister sheiks, pirates of Sartosa, and even the Dark Elf fleets. This mechanic could revolve around whether you're willing to work with or against the Corsairs, with each offering different bonuses and challenges. For instance, if you choose to work with the Arabian Corsairs, you gain substantial economic benefits from selling slaves and even can use them to rush construction, like the Dark Elves and Chaos Dwarfs. It also allows you to have a much easier time developing positive relationships with the more quote-unquote evil races, such as the Vampire Coast, Dark Elves, Chaos Dwarfs, and even Archon the Black. However, the forces of order will seek to stop your cruel empire, and the civilized races of the old world will send crusades in an attempt to bring you down like Jafar from ages past. So unique armies of knights mixed from Bretonnia, the Empire, and even Kislev might appear in your lands from the oceans to attack. Furthermore, your relations will heavily sour with the men of the old world, the high elves, and the dwarfs. On the other hand, if you choose to deny the Corsairs and seek a more noble route to power, this will earn you many allies among the other nations of men. Trade and alliances with the Order factions, including the High Elves and Dwarfs, will be substantially easier, as they have much to gain from your exotic resources. However, the Corsairs won't take this rejection lying down, and will seek to launch assaults against you. Rogue armies of pirates will harass your shores as they seek to enslave your people, and they may even call upon dark allies to reinforce their efforts. This path won't offer nearly as much explosive monetary value to your economy, and is less about brutally conquering everyone in an arm's reach, but does allow for more stable alliances and steadier growth on a global stage. When it comes to forging magic items, the Arabians are some of the most gifted creators of magical items to be found among humanity. They learned incredible amounts of wisdom for controlling the powers of sorcery, from interrogating captured elementals and even demons, learning fundamental truths from these various beings composed of raw magic. I would give the Araby faction a unique mechanic to represent this, by which they could see randomly spawning locations of interest, where elemental spirits or demons, known to the Arabians as Ifrits and Jinns, spawn due to powerful gatherings of magic. The player can move an army or a hero to these locations to trigger a dilemma, where you can either capture or bargain with the entity for various buffs. Bargaining with the spirits could increase your research rate for your tech tree and provide other buffs to the character/region/army that started the dilemma, along with perhaps receiving a small amount of a new resource we'll call Magic Essence for the sake of this video, though I'm sure there could be a better name for it. Should the player instead capture the spirit, this will grant a large amount of this Magic Essence resource, which can be used to craft magic items and recruit bound elementals as new units. These items would vary between those that have full elementals bound inside of them, like the classic magic lamp, which make for powerful army abilities that can only be used once as the spirit is released in an explosive manner, such as an powerful incarnate of life making for a large AoE heal ability, or a bound desert wind elemental dropping a massive debuff on enemy units. Perhaps some could even be campaign map specific, allowing you to do things like refresh an army's spent movement, or force an enemy army to be unable to move for a turn. There would also be a selection of items the player could forge similar to Tomb Kings and Dwarfs, though their selection should be relatively small compared to those races. The final unique mechanic, which I already mentioned a smidge earlier, is being able to bind minor elementals and full incarnate elementals to your faction. When selecting the capture option for a Jinn or Ifrit dilemma, you gain a resource that can be used to recruit elemental units. Honestly, this one feels a tad unnecessary, but it could be used to make the non-human units a bit more unique to acquire. I think most people would just prefer regular recruitment, though. So that wraps up mechanic musings for me. Let's discuss who would lead this new race should they arrive in the old world. The idea behind the mini race packs really embraces the mini aspect, meaning they get one legendary lord and that is it. The closest thing there is to an Arabian special character, in my opinion, would be the Golden Magus, one of the captains from the Dreadfleet tabletop game that gave us Count Noctilus, Aranessa, and Captain Yago Roth. This seems like an automatic pick in light of that, but I do have a huge problem with the Golden Magus in that he is in truth a Tzeentchian sorcerer. While the Tzeentch influence on Araby should be expressed in the game, I think it should be done through dilemmas and player decision, as opposed to a fundamental expression of the faction. However, I do think this issue could be resolved by altering the Golden Magus's character just a little bit. Instead of having him be a Tzeentch cultist right from the get-go, perhaps the campaign could start with him before he falls to Tzeentch. Then, the campaign story could revolve around him increasing his own power and seeking out ancient wisdom and artifacts while having to wrestle with the potential corruption of Tzeentch. For instance, he gets many dilemmas where agents of the Changer of Ways try to lure him on a darker path through bargains that grant him traits revolving around Tzeentch corruption, and on his skill tree he has a divided system like Tyrion does. Will you fall to corruption in pursuit of ultimate power and fall to Tzeentch? Or will you resist and have the Golden Magus take a far more noble path to cast out the influence of the Great Deceiver once and for all? I personally like this idea quite a bit, though admittedly it does require delving into the unknown history of the Golden Magus to handwave when he fell to Tzeentch specifically. As for how he works, the Golden Magus is an exceptionally powerful sorcerer who is the unrivaled master when it comes to the capturing and manipulating of elementals, which are known to the Arabians as jinns and ifrits. He has an impressive assortment of jars that each contain various magical entities, such as sea nymphs, fire ifrits, and tempest jinns. Thanks to recent discoveries, we now know that these creatures are likely to be minor elementals of Gairan, Akshi, and Hish, respectively, but we'll talk about that more in the unit section. The Golden Magus is also said to be an incredibly skilled warrior in combat, despite his advanced age, wielding an incredibly powerful and large blade known as the Flaming Scimitar, after which he named his luxurious warship. This burning weapon enchanted with hundreds of fire curses. Plus, he's just absolutely resplendent to look at, one of the wealthiest men to be found in the entirety of Araby, and he's not shy about showing off. A gifted caster able to likely wield multiple lores of magic, which is considered extremely illegal in the Empire, but he's not from the Empire, so he doesn't care. He would bring quite the unique spin to a human wizard. I think I envision him wielding a mix of the lores of metal, light, and fire. And if the player decides to go the corruption route with his skill tree, then he'd gain access to Tzeentchian spells on top of those he already has. Perhaps the alternative route would offer different strengths and more non-chaos spells. In any event, he's originally from El Kabath, but could easily start in any location that proves appropriate for Araby, whether that's one of the coastal settlements or the Wizard Caliph's palace, which I think would be cool, though we would need to move Archon, but just move Archon to his Black Tower for his start position. I think that would be way more appropriate for Archon anyway. I have no idea why he doesn't start in his tower, because his tower still isn't that close to Cetra, so it should be fine. Alternatively, he could also be put in the Great Desert of Araby settlement, which has an entire province to itself and is a pretty nice start position. That's not too bad, especially if they added a couple of extra regions to it. The other final thing about the Golden Magus that I think could be kind of fun is if they wanted to use some additional features that already exist in the game. Because he's from the Dreadfleet expansion, he could be given the Vampire Coast system of that he counts as a horde as well. So he's able to build up his ship, the Flaming Scimitar, with all sorts of fun, unique buildings, and it would allow him to recruit on the fly and have all sorts of like fun, unique army buffs that really make his army stand out compared to the rest of them, where he'd be exactly like the Vampire Coast in the sense that he is the only character in his entire faction who's able to build up settlements, or who counts as a horde, I should say, while all of the rest of the lords in his faction do not have that horde mechanic. They only count as regular armies. I think that would actually be a lot of fun. So that's the Golden Magus as an option. He's not perfect, but I think has excellent potential. The only other real option to me is Fatandira. She is technically a border princess found within the Northern Badlands, who suffered immensely at the hands of racists as her family were blamed for crimes committed by others, and brutally murdered after being forced to confess to witchcraft that they never did. She had her revenge on the people who wronged her by murdering the entire village in a single night, by stealthily moving from home to home in the twilight. The massacre brought her no joy, though she found it justified. But from that point on, she set out to become a ruler so that she might prevent such tragedies caused by bigotry and ignorance from occurring ever again. She has since gathered a small kingdom around herself and an army of loyal warriors to aid in conquering the villages near Mad Dog Pass, where she has ruled as a just ruler ever since. It's a bit of a stretch to drag her all the way home to Araby, but that could also be a core focus on her campaign, being that she must return to her ancestral home to reclaim it from the hands of crusaders, monsters, and the undead. Fatandira is said to be an incredible warrior, exceptionally gifted in cutting down potential challengers, though there aren't any magic items associated with her. It's a fairly weak connection to be the only Lord of Araby, but the idea of a warrior princess lord does hold some interest, in my opinion. Finally, Creative Assembly could, of course, just make a new original character. However, interviews that have taken place since the creation of Celostra Dirfan make me think that this will probably never happen again, as it seems to have been an exceptionally difficult process. That being said, if they wanted to bring to life one of the many rulers of the various cities, I would not be against the idea. Individuals such as the Great Sultan of Al Haik, Princess Yule It Torisi of Ras Karim, Al-Qadi Nasrin, the self-styled Caliph of Mahaba, and Hamka the Divine, the Sultan of Air. Personally, I'm all in on the Golden Magus with those slight edits I discussed earlier. In any event, that is the end of the potential faction leader / legendary lord, so let's move on to units and legendary heroes. There's only one legendary hero I would call upon to be acquirable in the Araby campaign to join your armies, and that would be the mercenary Werner Gluck, known better as Al-Muktar. Al-Muktar is heavily inspired by the real-life Lawrence of Arabia, though obviously there are quite a few notable differences. To keep things very brief, Werner Gluck originally came from Marienburg, and eventually made his way to Araby in search of adventure. He had spent his entire youth learning about the world outside of the exclusive boarding school he was raised in, and by the time he arrived in the port of Lashik, he had mastered the local language. His arrival to the desert nation aligned with an old legend about Al-Muktar, meaning the chosen one, who was prophesied to be a blessed man from a foreign land. In his journey to explore the deserts, he was captured by a group of mercenaries who thought to torture him for sport, but learned that Werner Gluck was made of sterner stuff than the average man due to a life of hardship. Eventually, from a mixture of being impressed by his tenacity and frightened by how he matched the legend of Al-Muktar, they came to believe that he was in fact the chosen one of myth. Shedding his original name and identity, Al-Muktar took over as the leader of the mercenary band, who came to be known as the Desert Dogs. Famed for their immense scimitars and moon crescent shields that they wield expertly from horseback, these mercenaries have proven to be skilled foes against Arabians, the undead, and any others unfortunate enough to face them in battle. So, Al-Muktar is a powerful melee combatant who can be mounted on an Arabian stallion to destroy your foes, as he's so skilled at doing. He should provide excellent buffs to cavalry units in your army, perhaps bonuses to sacking and raiding due to his legendary mercenary status, and just be a solid beatstick in close combat. Obviously, the Desert Dogs themselves should be a regiment of renown for Araby, or maybe they just get unique access to them if the Desert Dogs end up being a true mercenary unit via Dogs of War mechanics that we'll talk about another day. Alright, with that, we're on to units, and then we can finally leave. The lord choices for Araby should either be the Sheik, which can be the melee commander / melee fighter option, and then for the wizard lords, we could have perhaps wizard caliphs or elementalists, which we'll get into later. I don't know what little title would be best for them, as generally Arabian wizards are often called sorcerers or elementalists, so you could pick any of those, to be honest. Anyway, moving on. The Sheik. For the Sheiks, I think they should be able to ride on horse, Arabian horse, of course, camel, or elephant. They should have a very, very strong focus on being, that kind of hybrid between a skilled melee fighter while also being an exceptional commander. I don't necessarily see them being like pure super melee badass, but maybe they focus on having magical attacks due to Araby's particular skill at crafting magic items, so they carry like really cool scimitars that have magical fire or whatever around it. And they should definitely be very strongly focused on buffing nearby troops in various ways. The elementalists, meanwhile, I think could be allowed to ride on Arabian horse, flying carpet, or elephant. When it comes to their magic choices for the elementalists, I would probably give them a selection between the lores of fire, metal, light, and death. Those would be the most logical lores of magic that they would specialize in, having lived in the desert lands all of these years, as those lores tend to most strongly synergize with living out in the deserts and the kinds of things that Araby focuses on. However, I could absolutely see the argument for the lore of heavens as well. Beasts, life, and shadows seem the least likely to me, but I wouldn't be against giving them all of the battle lores, as Araby is said to be the most gifted of the nations of men when it comes to wielding magic. Or maybe they could have a collection of mixed lore elementalists to demonstrate some uniqueness, as they aren't held back by the strictures of the elves like the Empire and Bretonnia are. So, for instance, you could have an elementalist who perhaps has a mix of the lores of light and shadow, and another one that has a mix of the lores of death and life, and another one that has a mix of the lores of fire and beasts, and then metal and I forget what the other, heavens. Alternatively, you could have one that wields, I would probably just take the 8 lores and either divide them by 2, so you have 4 different kinds of elementalists that have a mix of 2 lores, or you could divide it by 4 and have it where you have 2 elementalists that have a mix as well. That kind of smacks to me of like a little too Grand Cathay with the whole thing of like yin and yang, but at the same time, Grand Cathay doesn't actually have that though, do they? Because their whole thing is yin and yang. So I guess you could do that with the elementalists. Have 2 of them. And then one of them has 4 lores of magic mixed, and the other one has the other 4 lores of magic mixed. I think that could be pretty good. So I would either do 4 of them or 2 of them. But I actually really, really like the idea of mixed lores for them, because you would never see that among the humans, right? Like the Fey Enchantress is an elf, so she gets away with shenanigans. Though technically, I think in Total War she only uses the lore of life, if I remember right. But among all of those nations of men, you don't have mixed lore wizards. They're not really allowed to be a thing. So having that with Araby, I think, could actually be a really cool expression and a really unique flavor. In any event, moving on to heroes. For heroes, my recommendations are the magicians, or fakirs as they're known for your magic users. They should be able to ride Arabian horses and flying carpets and have the same lores as I discussed above, or different variants, or maybe because they're the heroes, they only get like a single lore or whatever, but similar concept. When it comes to the warrior heroes, we should have the emirs, who should specialize more in defense and protection compared to the more offensive sheiks, at least in my opinion, to help really give them a feel, where the sheik maybe wields like a 2-handed scimitar or a big scimitar and shield. Maybe the emirs wield some sort of halberd or a shield and more of like a polearm type weapon. They're more defensive, could have like guardian, or just focus on keeping their lords and masters alive. And for them, I would have them able to ride on Arabian horse or camel. On to regular units. We thankfully have an easy roster to pull from thanks to good old War Master, so we'll start from there, though I am going to add some things at the end. I'll read off the War Master description that's been provided for all of these units from the original setting, and then I will add my own thoughts onto them about how they should perform or be implemented into Total War. I will note that I haven't really come up with any particularly great ideas for how best to make Arabian units, or Arabian, I don't know, it'd probably be Arabian, even though it's a Y, Arabyan, not Arabian. But anyway, I'm just going to say Arabian for the sake of ease. Units stand out in regards to passive or active abilities in battle, or how to make them stand out against similar units. There are some where I will have straightforward recommendations on particular abilities they should have, but that is based on information that is already kind of provided with the unit. I'm not going to sit here and go over, like, you know, how the Kislevites have the Motherland passive where they become unbreakable for a little bit when their leadership gets really, really low. I'm not going to spend time trying to think of anything for that right now. So, for example, when we talk about Empire Spearmen versus Arabian Spearmen, I'm not really going to get super nitty gritty about how you would want to make them too different. Though I will say a very general note of, for the most part, Arabian units would probably be faster than most other human units because they would be more lightly armored due to, you know, wearing lots of heavy armor in the desert is not generally advisable. It's more about speed and being able to get where you need to go fast. But I will leave that to smarter people, not me. Anyway, let's move on. So the first unit, Arabian Spearmen. The original War Master description says, Arabian armies are based upon regiments of infantry. They garrison the cities and towns and enforce law and order throughout Araby, as well as forming its standing army. The majority of these warriors carries tall spears and shields and fight in well-disciplined ranks. Amongst these troops are some distinctive regiments, which traditionally fight with curved swords or which wear uniforms peculiar to their place of origin. So for the Arabian Spearmen in Total War, obviously most of them would be your low-tier anti-large infantry that are lightly armored with charge defense against large and some charge reflection. Functionally, Empire Spearmen, and I think it'd be fine for them to come with a non-shielded variant where they're just two-handing the spear, and then a shielded variant where they've got a shield and spear, just like you do with the Empire. There's also a note in their War Master description that some of them, despite the fact they're called spearmen, don't actually fight with spears, but instead fight with scimitars or other curved blades, which would functionally just be Arabian swordsmen. So I think including Arabian swordsmen as well as under that kind of banner is just fine. So you have your spearmen with two hands on the spear, your spearmen with one-handed spears and shields, and then your spearmen that have curved swords and shields. Next up is the Arabian Guards. The household troops of the rulers of Araby are famously loyal and lavishly equipped. They carry weapons of the finest quality and wear brightly colored clothes of silk brocade. Brocade? Each sultan, caliph, and many lesser nobles and sorcerers have their own corps of guards. So loyal are they that they would die at their own hands if their master so commanded. Similarly, dedicated are bodies drawn from some of the outlandish communities of the south, including the dread daughters of Tariq from the land of assassins and the silent guard of Inuk Mountain. So for the Arabian Guards in Total War, these would be your medium or elite tier infantry that specialize in being more heavily armored, though I imagine Arabia's faction, as I said earlier, would not really specialize too heavily into like true heavy armor, you know, not plate a lot of the time. I could see there being two tiers of Arabian Guard, where maybe one is slightly more heavily armored to make a proper elite version. That way you have 3 tiers of infantry for melee. For their equipment, I imagine there would be 3 variants. There would be a great weapon variant that have big two-handed swords. There would be a scimitar and crescent shield variant. And then there would probably be a halberd variant to give you some better anti-large foot troops with armor piercing. What I do find very interesting in the old War Master description is that it's specifically called out that there are men and women making up Arabian Guards, where we have specifically mentioned the Dread Daughters of Tariq, which I do think is very, very cool. Kind of brings to mind for me like how Grand Cathay, you see mixed gender units among a lot of their infantry, especially like the Celestial Dragon Guard. So seeing something similar for Araby would be really cool. And it kind of makes sense that Araby is calling everybody out to fight as opposed to trying to have some people stay safe back in the cities and other people march out to fight, because in the desert, no place is truly safe. Everyone has to pull their weight. Next up is the Arabian bowmen. The men of Araby place great faith in the bow, and all the cities of Araby maintain strong bodies of archers. Although firearms are known in Araby, they are nowhere near as common or as advanced as those used in the old world and are rarely issued to common troops. So that description is actually fairly out of date, uniquely among the War Master descriptions, compared to the more modern lore we have on Araby, where Araby, as the lore continued to evolve over the years, even though Araby did not get as much of a focus once War Master was over, they have received significant updates to their gunpowder technology, where Araby now has a very strong focus on gunpowder, and even is said to be where the Jezzail that the Skaven use was first invented, though they spell it with one Z, not two Zs, because 2Z means it's Skaven, 1Z means it's the Arabian variant. But as far as the Arabian bowman goes, this one is very straightforward. Just your standard low-tier archer unit that provides solid ranged infantry unit. Probably more of a spread out skirmish formation, similar to the basic tier Empire archers. So let's move on to cavalry. We have Arabian cavalry. First up is the Arabian Knights. The War Master description says, horses are highly prized in Araby amongst both the sultans of the coast and the sheiks of the inland deserts. The Arabians are rightfully proud of their cavalry. They are ornately equipped with long lances, tall helms, and glittering armor. I must say, I love the imagery that comes to mind with the Arabian Knights, with their iconic mix of tall helms, flowing robes, and shining heavy armor, at least as far as heavy armor is advised for when you're fighting in the heat of the desert. A strong mid-tier cavalry unit that I would kind of put them on par with like the silver helms of the elves, where they're more about speed, but certainly are not lacking in the armor department. They're just not as heavily armored as what we'd see in, say, the Empire. They should come with a lance and shield version along with a scimitar and shield version. So one that's more designed for charge bonus and one that's more designed for maybe like longer engagements in melee. Next up are the Arabian Desert Riders. The War Master description says, the deep deserts of Araby are home to fierce nomads whose swift riders are the best light cavalry in the world. The cities of the coast also maintain bodies of light cavalry for scouting and patrols, but all agree the riders of the desert are the finest and the most dashing. So the Desert Riders are, of course, your light cavalry that are insanely fast and good at running down enemy ranged units or low-tier creature units like Warhounds. These guys should be one of the fastest cavalry units in the entire game, as Arabian horses are said to be the fastest steeds found in the entirety of the realms of men. I would say that there should be two variants. One should be a bow variant, and the other should just be a melee variant, very similar to the High Elf Illyrian Reavers. Next up are the iconic Arabian Camel Riders. Their War Master description says, the camel is a workaday creature in the land of Araby, where it is common to see long trains marching from the deserts into the markets and bazaars of the coastal towns. Camel caravans carry all kinds of exotic spices, cloth, and foodstuffs from the eastern valleys of the Adelan Mountains and beyond. It is only the fierce warriors of the desert tribes that ride these intractable creatures into battle. Camel riders are brave and notoriously savage warriors who navigate their way across the shifting sands of Araby by an uncanny instinct, unfathomable and mysterious to mere city dwellers. They are guided as much by their knowledge of the deep desert as by their desert-born mounts, and some would say, by their taste for blood. Ooh, scary. In any event, the Camel Riders of Araby are exceptionally more terrifying than the initial mental image might suggest. These are high-tier heavy cavalry that have immense resistance to vigor loss, I imagine, as camels are tough as hell. Very stubborn beasts that are practically tenacity incarnate. These should be exceptionally tanky cavalry that excel in prolonged combat rather than having to rely as heavily on constant charges. Could have just a single variant, or alternatively do the demigriff system of one having anti-large weapons like something along the lines of halberds, while the other version has more stereotypical lances. So, you have your variant that's more designed to get into the thick of things and continue fighting, and you have your other variant that's meant more to slam into the enemy's flanks and rears, do a bunch of damage, then fall back. I must say, I love the mental image of camel riders, especially because like camel cavalry did exist in our world. You don't hear about them very much, but apparently they were pretty scary. Next up, and the last of the cavalry section, are the Arabian flying carpets. The War Master description says, the sorcerers of Araby have perfected the art of binding aerial spirits into physical forms, not least of which is the famous flying carpet. Carpets carry 2 or sometimes 3 riders, who arm themselves with bows as well as various missiles. These are thrown into the enemy's ranks and include such unpleasant surprises as pots of scorpions, serpents, fire ants, hornets, and venomous spiders. So, the immensely iconic flying carpets make for a fascinating flying cavalry unit that relies more on ranged harassment and speed over anything else. I would probably have them wield gunpowder weapons in Total War instead of bows to make them a bit stronger, as War Master relied more heavily on the much, much older lore before Araby received some considerable updates to their science and technology, which has them as an immensely skilled faction when it comes to long-barreled gunpowder weapons. After all, it was Araby, as I talked about earlier, that invented the Jezzail, which Clan Skryre later stole to create their own bastardized version. Flying carpets seem like they'd really struggle as a melee unit due to the mount being pretty much unable to assist the rider in combat like you expect from a Pegasus or a Disc of Tzeentch. So this unit should probably just focus on being incredibly difficult to catch due to high speed and have lots of ammo to constantly shoot people with. Though whether they should have full-on Jezzails up there or just handguns is a matter of debate. Personally, I lean much more towards them just having handguns so they don't have crazy long range and armor piercing. Like I feel like you kind of want them to be the middle of that system. I must say, though, they should absolutely come with the drop rocks ability like the Lizardman Pterodon riders have, because I just love that. But instead of dropping boulders on you, instead they're hurling down pots full of horrific venomous critters of the desert. Because I'll tell you what, I would not want to fight an army in any universe where they're like throwing camel spiders at me from up above. No, thank you. I think that actually makes for a really cool type of drop rock ability where they have like a certain amount, where gyrocopters are dropping bombs and lizardmen are dropping rocks. They're flying over you, throwing pots down at you that can deal maybe a special type of venom effect, maybe like Sotex venom from the lizardmen, where it deals damage over time instead of the traditional poison. So, you only get 1 or 2 uses of it per battle, but depending on where you use it, it can deal some pretty significant nasty damage via debuffs or just flat damage over time, which is pretty awesome. So let's move on to the final category, which are the Arabian war beasts. So we have, of course, the elephants. The elephant riders, I should say. Elephants are an exotic creature, even in Araby, for they come from the lush bushlands that lie between Araby and the jungles of the Southlands. The sultans like to collect all kinds of wild and monstrous beasts, and they eagerly compete against each other when it comes to maintaining the largest and most impressive herd of elephants. These are ferocious and dangerous creatures, all the more so because each carries a wooden tower upon its back, within which ride Arabian warriors armed with long spears and assorted missiles that they hurl at their enemies below. So the Arabian elephant riders are quite straightforward, being a unit of very powerful, monstrous cavalry with a howdah on the back full of warriors equipped with bows or guns to unleash hell on enemies. I'm not entirely sure or committed to the idea of whether this should be a unique type of monstrous cavalry unit where there's like 4 elephants per unit, or if instead it should be a single elephant monster more akin to a lizardman stegodon. Personally, the more I think about it and kind of like hem and haw over it, as much as I love the idea of a herd of elephants being all pissed off and ripping people apart, I think a single entity unit seems far more likely and appropriate. And I should note for those curious that the Arabian elephants are not nearly as large as the mammoths of Norska. They are much more akin to our world's elephants. So, they're still terrifyingly huge and large creatures, but they're not, they're much more on par with a stegodon, not a war mammoth or a dread saurian, if that makes sense. All right. So that brings us to the end of the official War Master army list for Araby, but there are a handful of units that have been added to Araby's lore and identity in the many years since that need to be included in the roster, in my opinion. As I mentioned in the history/lore section, Araby is well established as being a nation that advanced heavily in the arts of science and technology, particularly when it came to subjects such as alchemy, magic, and gunpowder. So the following section is going to include units that have cropped up in later writings and explorations of Araby. The first is the Arabian Jezzails. The Jezzails are extremely long-range and powerful guns that require something to balance the almost comically long barrel, usually by using a pavis, which are those big shields you see the Skaven and Grand Cathay using. Araby, in my opinion, should have two variants on the Jezzail. The first is your very standard infantry version, where two people run around, with one being the sniper pulling the trigger and aiming, and the other carrying a pavis that they use to stabilize the weapon while also defending against enemy ranged fire. The other variant is very unique to Araby, and I love the idea of, which is a cavalry version of the Jezzail. Rather than using a pavis carried by a second human, instead, the Jezzail is stabilized on the back of a camel, with the creature's back humps providing that function, the stability, whether it has like a little thing that's built up on the camel's back, or they just balance it on the humps because they're just that good. This allows for them to have far more mobility and health than standard Jezzails, which I just think is awesome and could really show their mastery, as while they might not have the finest quality of black powder by any means like the dwarves and Grand Cathay do, and they may not have nearly as broad a range of sophisticated gunpowder technology with like all sorts of different kinds of guns like the Empire does, nor do they rely on some fairly unique weapons when it comes to black powder like you might see in Tele and Nostalgia. Araby does have their own very unique spin on things, like the mounted Jezzail. Next up are the Arabian muskets/handguns. This unit is by far the least exciting of the units I'll be talking about, which is just a standard handgun unit. Though whether they be called muskets or handguns or some other term is for someone smarter than me to figure out. But this would give Araby a very nice mid-tier ranged unit between their Arabian archers or bowmen and Arabian Jezzails. I will say that I think it's perfectly fine for them to have these. They should probably not be as low tier as like Empire handguns, because as I don't think that Araby produces nearly as many firearms as the Empire does. Not at all. So their handguns, there's probably should be some kind of uniqueness to them. Like maybe they're more expensive, but they have longer range, because Arabians have to invest so much more from their perspective into creating handguns, whereas the Empire can almost do it at a factory pace. But like I said, that's someone for someone smarter than me to figure out, to try and make them unique and fun. I also think it'd be cool for them to have a different title other than just Arabian handguns, because like we have Empire handgunners. So hopefully some other term could be used that means roughly the same thing, which could be fun. All right, now we're on to the really exciting stuff. The Elementalists of Araby are said to primarily encounter three types of desert spirits, or elementals, or genies, or whatever you want to call them, out in the desert that they bind under their control. I think each of these three distinct types should feature as a unit of monstrous infantry that provide Araby some really unique elemental creatures that are similar to the Chaos Dwarf Kadai Fireborn, by bringing in some solid, unbreakable, magic damage dealing elite troops to the table who probably have a decent amount of physical resistance because they're literally made of magic. For those curious, in the more modern lore, it was revealed that the desert spirits the Arabians have encountered over the centuries are in fact lesser elementals, so minor incarnations of the winds of magic. In the recent Shadows of Change DLC, to make a point, we see the incarnate elemental of beasts for Kislev and the Beastmen, which are the big bad incarnations of Gur, or the Amber Wind of Beasts. Lesser elementals are the same type of thing, but they're smaller versions of these entities. So kind of like comparing a Kadai Destroyer, which would be more like the incarnate elemental, versus the Kadai Fireborn, which is more like the lesser elemental, as I said earlier, being a monstrous infantry unit rather than a singular large big bad. The first variant of the lesser elementals we're going to talk about are the Djinns, which in truth are incarnations of Hish, the White Wind of Light. These embodiments of the Wind of Light are commonly misunderstood to be wind spirits, as like Hish itself, they can casually drift through the air, and being made of light are difficult to fully perceive and can move shockingly fast. Shockingly, there we go. Tendrils of light swirling about like a cyclone. Hish is drawn to the scorching deserts of Araby and Nehekhara, so these elementals exist here in abundance. The Djinns can be bound to serve the Arabians as a powerful monstrous infantry unit that should specialize in exorcising other harmful forms of magic while providing protection to those allies bathing in their light. The swiftest of the three lesser elemental units that specializes in having disrupting attacks, so they lower physical resistance and increase miscast chance with their melee attacks, while also providing some sort of defensive buff to nearby allies, perhaps in the form of leadership or resistances to certain forms of damage. So these guys should walk a line between offense and defense, and should be particularly strong against undead and chaos units, or magical units, should we say. I would love for them to have some kind of special bonus when they're fighting against undead and chaos and summons and all that type of things. Maybe they deal a little form of bonus damage or some such. Next up are the Ifrits, which are deadly spirits of flame that incinerate those unfortunate enough to earn their wrath. As you may guess, Ifrits are in truth lesser elementals of Akshi, the red wind of fire. These enraged creatures are the most offensive of the lesser elementals, purely focused on raw damage output. Obviously, equipped with fire damage on top of the basic elemental gimmicks, they should be all about being able to tear through enemies and absolutely shred armor. Perhaps could also have the burning body passive ability from the Chaos Dwarfs, as the same fundamental concept should apply to them, and ultimately they are fairly similar creatures to the Kadai Fireborn. The main difference between the Ifrits and the Fireborn being that the Ifrits should have virtually no armor, because they don't have all the crazy magical armor that keeps the Fireborn under the Chaos Dwarf's control and binds them into a certain form. But the counter to that is that the Ifrits should be unbreakable forever, instead of the ability to fall apart at low health like the Kadai do, because the Kadai have sort of built-in runes that cause them to start breaking down. They essentially burn through the very runes and magical systems that bring them to life, which the Chaos Dwarfs intentionally designed them that way. That's why when your Kadai get low enough in health, they then become subjected to the unbinding system, where they start to take damage over time if their leadership is too low. I do not think that the Ifrit should suffer from that, because they're purely creatures of magic. Finally, among the spirits utilized by Araby, there's a strong focus on sea nymphs, feminine entities that are found in the great ocean who are flowing creatures seemingly made of water. Due to Araby being a nation largely based along the coast, the ocean plays a key role in most aspects of Arabian life, and they know well to rely on its bounty to ensure their own survival. Sea nymphs are in truth lesser elementals of Gairan, the jade wind of life. The sea itself is the largest reservoir of jade magic to be found in the world, as water is of course the fundamental basis of all life. These should be the most defensive out of the lesser elemental units, carrying a large amount of health and the ability to regenerate should they stand in water features, which can be found among many battle maps in the game, such as swamps or lakey areas or places with rivers and such. Of course, they should have the aquatic trait and have the best stats when it comes to survivability of the lesser elementals. Now, I will say, I did say earlier that they should all be unbreakable, but that's another thing I've been kind of hemming and hawing on, because we've seen that like the incarnate elementals, like the big bad ones, are purely unbreakable, but at the same time, they are entities of magic, which to me kind of suggests that they should function more like demons, where they can break down over time as the magic is kind of unwound from them. But, you know, I'll leave that to someone that's working in balancing to figure out whether they should break out down over time or whether they should just be purely unbreakable. All right, the next section we'll be looking at are the big bad monsters of the Araby roster, the heavy hitters, the showstoppers, the monstrous single entities with powerful abilities and impressive animations. For this, I shall call upon the incarnate elementals we have yet to see in the game, though this will lead us to a little bit of a conundrum I'll talk about in a moment. On one hand, we could simply look to the big versions of the three wins we've already discussed. So bringing forth for Araby the incarnate elementals of light, fire, and life. I think this would be perfectly suited, as if we look at the original Dreadfleet model for the Golden Magus, it features these very same three monstrous creatures as part of his ship. Granted, their designs are rather simplified. I will show some artwork somewhere in this section showing what they look like in the more modern stuff, but I still think the idea works. This would allow the designers as well to probably make things a bit easier to create the lesser and incarnate elementals for each wind side by side, allowing them to have similar themes while also ensuring there is a distinct appearance to each. You know, it's much, much easier, I imagine, from a design perspective, to have someone creating the lesser incarnate elemental of Hish and the incarnate elemental of Hish, or light, right next to one another, so you can make sure that they are understandably similar creatures, but of course the incarnate elemental is an extreme. It's that slider maxed out. The downside that is worth talking about very briefly is that while the incarnate elementals of fire and life have artwork to show that what they look like, the incarnate elemental of light has thus far remained entirely shrouded in mystery. None of the three of these, I should note, have ever appeared as tabletop models, however, as Forge World sadly only managed to craft a tabletop miniature for the incarnate elemental of beasts before all of their projects going forward were canceled due to the end times. However, I will note that the incarnate elemental of beasts was created in the very same book, being the Monstrous Arcanum, that also contained the incarnate elementals of fire and death. So if we can get the incarnate elemental of beasts in game, I don't see any reason why the other one should not be allowed. This, of course, does bring forward the note, as you may have just your ears may have perked up, that the incarnate elemental of death is available. Though to me personally, I think it just doesn't really fit Araby nearly as well as the other three. It would sort of just be there. You could, of course, argue that maybe one of the spirits could end up being an incarnate or a lesser elemental of death, but I feel like three types of elementals is already a lot. And death doesn't really fit Araby's culture. You know, death is very distinct, of course, for like the Nehakarans, who were obsessed with death. But Arabians don't have that relationship with death like they do. They are although there are similarities, of course, between the Nehacaran culture and Arabian culture, they are still very, very distinct. And I feel like that obsession with death is something that did not migrate over to Araby's culture. So personally, I really think it would be far more fitting if we ever do get the incarnate elemental of death for him to just appear somewhere else in the game. I don't think it's necessary by any means the imagination to have him in Araby just because we have him. You know, he should be somewhere else. I could, of course, see the argument that Araby, as the elemental focus faction, should have access to all of the incarnate elementals, but personally, I think that just adds way too much bloat to that particular part of the roster. It should be the humans of Araby supplemented by elementals, not the other way around. So for the sake of this video, I would purely recommend only having the incarnate elementals of light, fire, and life. I do love the incarnate elemental of death, but I think he should wait until a more proper time in the future. But I do think that the rest of those should be totally fair and awesome and great. Finally, there is one last category, which is a singular unit that doesn't actually have much of a basis in the lore, but I think nonetheless would make a fantastic addition for Araby's roster, and I also don't think it would be that much of a stretch. Currently, there aren't any actual war machines or siege weapons in their roster, which I suppose does make sense, as trying to lug around heavy war machines through the sands of the desert just sounds like an absolute disaster. The desert is, of course, infamously corrosive due to the winds and sand particles and stuff everywhere. And if you just have like these big, heavy machines, on wheels or whatever, that's just going to be awful. They're just going to sink in the sand and get stuck all the time. And it's just awful. So how can we solve this issue? Well, elephants, of course. I recommend a variant on the Arabian elephant riders, where instead of a melee focused one with its big tower howdah full of handgunners or archers, instead it has on its little tower platform a cannon. A sexy, long-barreled cannon that unleashes some absolute hell as the elephant comes charging in. So kind of like, imagine fusing like Little Grom or the Skull Cannon, where, you have that big singular device going like kaboom, but combine it with a Stegodon. So instead of it being a chariot, it's instead a monster that has a big black powder weapon on its back. I just think that's awesome. And I also don't think it'd be that much of a stretch. And yeah, cool. Give it to me. There's also very, very last and slight. There is a very specific place in Araby that is called the Land of Dervishes, which implies that dervishes are around and should be part of the roster. From what I understand about dervishes, the term means something very similar to Empire flagellants. So people that are known for being like incredibly frenzied and fighting in close combat with like very little regards for defense or like protecting themselves. Instead, they're just going in to cause as much damage as possible. But they tend to be kind of like wild, not wild in the sense that they're like feral, but like they're kind of like all jazzed up, ready to go. And they're very, very similar to Empire flagellants. So essentially an unbreakable, no armor infantry unit that just tears people apart, which I do think sounds very, very cool. Maybe people who have particularly lost themselves to the desert and been stricken by a desert madness or something, or they're particularly dedicated to the deific-like spirit entities that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So, in any event, that concludes pretty much everything I'll be discussing in regards to Araby, the desert nation. I hope you all enjoyed this proposal video and found it entertaining, or at least interesting. I genuinely, deeply, passionately think that Araby deserves to walk alongside the other races of Warhammer Fantasy, as they bring such a unique dynamic and style to the game, along with being almost smack in the middle of the Immortal Empire's map. I do want to reiterate one last time, very, very strongly, that it is very important to remember that Araby is not Muslim or Islamic or anything similar in the modern lore. The Abrahamic religions, as I talked about earlier, do not have counterparts in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. That is something that has been very, very deliberately avoided. The most recent exploration of the lore of Araby suggests that what form of religion they do have revolves much more around revering and acknowledging immensely powerful spirits of the land. The three that they talk about are the Sultan of Flames, who is said to be an immense Ifrit who represents concepts like the desert heat, the sun, and warfare. There's also the Raging Tempest, who's a big, scary, immense Jinn, who represents the desert itself and the titanic sandstorms that plague the desert. And then the Sea Monarch, an immense sea nymph that is a protector goddess who represents life, cleansing, and of course the sea. Though these three seem to be more gods that are meant more to be placated and giving offerings to ask for their blessings or for their mercy. So like, don't hurt us and leave us alone. Than what may normally jump to your mind when thinking about religion. Though that's actually fairly standard in Warhammer. Worship in the Warhammer Fantasy universe doesn't really work like the worship in our universe, which is a very, very, very common misconception. I will say that, however, if Creative Assembly and Games Workshop do team up to give us Araby, as they damn well should, I could very, very easily see the culture and religion of Araby receiving some rather intensive updates to flesh it out significantly more and try and really kind of delve deep into what makes them unique, what makes them tick, and all that other type of stuff. So I just really wanted to reiterate that because I cannot tell you how many times, as I said earlier in the video, I have been live streaming or talking or whatever, and somebody, the second I mention Araby, somebody jumps in immediately and is always like, "Oh, they would never do Araby. They would never. They're like, they can't. They can't." It's like, yes, they absolutely can. Shut up. Sit down. Be quiet. Nobody wants to hear your bullshit. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. I cannot express my deep, deep gratitude to each and every one of you for showing up to view my content. Furthermore, I do want to take a moment to thank all of my patrons over on Patreon, in particular, for helping support me, especially over the past few months, something I frankly need to be a lot better about. I do want to give a very special shout out and thank you to Sign of the Emperor, Eric, Hurls, Eckhart Thalion, Hologon, Mr. Vorm, and Squats. Love you all. Appreciate you guys. Y'all do more than you know. And of course, other names that y'all will see flashing around on screen. For the next proposal video regarding the mini races, I think I'm going to turn my attention over to good old Talea, but feel free to suggest other races down below for me to consider. I kind of think I'm between Talea and the Hobgoblin Khanate. I don't know which one I want to do, but it's probably between those two for the next one. I will note that the Blood Naga of Koresh and the Kingdoms of End will not be included in this series, as I feel very strongly those are going to be big race packs like the Chaos Dwarfs, not many ones like I'm suggesting with Araby. You know, with Araby, I'm suggesting a fairly small roster and a single legendary lord and a single legendary hero, and that's it. You know, I'm not talking about like 3 legendary lords and a legendary hero and like a whole bunch of units and all this other crazy stuff. Anyway, thank you all one final time. I am trying to be more active about dedicating daily time slots to writing scripts for this video, as you can tell when my videos are scripted, I think. So hopefully I'll have more to show for it in the coming days and weeks, as God knows this channel needs more consistency. And I just like talking about these things, but they do require research. You know, this isn't the kind of thing where I just want to talk out of my ass for like 4 hours. That's it for me. Do let me know if what you think about Araby down below. Is this something that you would absolutely love to have? Would you buy it? For how much? Knowing that that's something, unfortunately, we have to ask about these days. Did I miss anything that you think should absolutely be included? Or is there anything that you disagree with fundamentally and you think that, no, we should do this instead, or this should be changed? I will be reading those comments and replying to as many of them as I can. Hope you all have a lovely day, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.